Hello. Hey, how's it going? My name's Merlin. I'm the sound tech for this festival. We're going to get into the third session for the day. John Noack from the Existentialist Society, talking about existentialism and the Existentialist Society as a para-academic paradigm. Take it away, John.
Thank you. The main theme is, can existentialism be both atheistic and religious? Now, this talk on existentialism addresses the following questions. What is existentialism in general, and what are its six main themes? 2, what is religious existentialism? 3, what is spiritual and spiritual but not religious existentialism? 4 is, what is the modern philosophical, religious and spiritual context for existentialism? And then we finally address the main question is, can existentialism be both atheistic and religious? Now, during the 1970s, when I was a student in Middle Eastern Studies at Melbourne University, I was able to listen to lectures on existentialism which were presented by Dr. Max Charlesworth in his course on modern European philosophy. However, his fellow lecturers at Melbourne University tended to be very critical when he was dealing with existentialism as a philosophy. They felt that this discipline is to be understood as the love of wisdom. However, this could become very abstract, but in contrast, existentialism turned out to be a very practical and down-to-earth way of life, or dealing with the issues while living. So it was quite different. It was more concerned with living than just with thinking, abstract thinking. Now, these then I went to existentialist meetings since the 1970s, and these were held at various venues outside of the official academia. These public talks have stressed that existentialism is a rather practical and down-to-earth philosophy. It is a word which includes the concepts of existence and the verb to exist. Therefore, it gives a priority to experiencing human existence and the challenges of living over a concern for human essence or being. Then during the 1960s, I studied Lutheran theology in Adelaide, so I have been interested in how Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish Lutheran, applied existentialism to his own Lutheranism. Kierkegaard stressed both the need for relationality, or interhuman relational interactions, and also his well-known leap of faith. And this was not a leap into belief, as most people think it is, but it was a leap in relation to our need to be bold and trusting when making our choices in life. He was certainly in agreement with the view that existence or existing and choice-making need to have precedence or priority over any conceived dogmatic or dogmatized essence. So what is existentialism actually? It has placed much stress on the individual and on the individual's need to make and to accept responsibility for their conscious choices. These choices tend to relate to our human nature and our human condition. As a result, at least 6 basic themes usually arise within any discourse relating to the philosophy or the ideology, or we might say the way of living, of existentialism, which usually deals with the human condition in a purely human, secular, and increasingly atheistic context and terms. Hence, it appears that most existentialists see themselves as being atheists and who have developed an atheistic existentialism. But whatever sort of existentialism, the 6 basic themes all happen to conveniently begin with the letter A. And they include 1, actuality of our existing selves and persons. 2 is our anxieties or experiences of angst. 3 is the perceived absurdity of our existence as it is experienced. 4 is our awareness of a vast and deep abyss, or depth, or nothingness. 5, the threat of personal death and of a collective annihilation in a future Hiroshima. And 6, our alienation from aspects of ourselves and form of our increasingly materialistic Western society. Now, all these are very commonly explored within existentialism. We will deal with these themes or tropes on the assumption that they are all irrelevant to general existentialism, in whatever form it takes. And that includes both the religious and the atheistic human condition. They can therefore be explored and applied personally by the use of our plural our. So we can, on that basis, since they deal with a fairly wide perspective, we can say, well, perhaps that's also our situation. Now, at this point, I just want to make the point that if you want to note down any page number or paragraph number, from here on, all the paragraphs are actually numbered or referenced. So if you want to jot them down so that we can refer back to them later in a question or a comment, that would be quite a good idea. Now, number 1 was actuality. The theme of actuality. The first existentialist theme relates to the basic standpoint of our actuality, which includes the position that our existence precedes or is an issue before our actual essence, but does not preclude or neglect our essence. This priority implies that our existence, our becoming, our ethical freedom, and our need to make conscious choices has primacy over our essence and our being. We are conscious subjects rather than mechanical robots or things to be precisely predicted or manipulated. Therefore, we each exist as an individual and a choice-making conscious beings who do not act simply in accordance with any strict definition or essence or generalization or any system. Existentialism says that what we are is our own conscious existence. Number 2 is angst. The second existentialist theme or trope is that of anxiety, or the German concept of Angst. This includes the sense of anguish, a generalized uneasiness, and a fear or dread which is not directed to any specific object. It's a general angst, anxiety. Anguish or angst, therefore, can relate to the dread of the perceived nothingness of human existence. This theme is as old as the rather pessimistic Soren Kierkegaard, and even earlier than him, of course, but within modern existentialism, and it involves the claim that anguish is an underlying, all-pervasive, universal condition of human existence. Now, in this context, René Girard has also explored the underlying human condition, and he has detected the emergence of primal envy, of scapegoating, and of a desire to kill the person who possessed the object which was being desired or coveted. There was an angst of covetousness. This very emotionally intense and primal situation was depicted in the biblical Cain and Abel story, in which the envious cattle herder Cain killed his seemingly innocent agriculturalist brother Abel. Such biblical myths also reflect the reality of a sort of a primal trauma. In this context of religion, existentialism to some extent agrees with certain streams of thought within theologically expressed Christianity, which see human existence as fallen from the essence or being of a perfect image of God, and which see human life as subsequently having to live in suffering, sin, guilt, and an anxiety about failure to be saved and a future in hellfire. This has contributed to the entries in prayer books and whatnot that humans have to confess themselves to be utter worms, corrupt, that sort of thing because of this original sin. But existentialism is prepared to take a more positive view here. The rather dark and foreboding picture of human life is at present being rejected by many current Christians. However, it appears to have influenced various existentialists to reject the more pleasant ideas such as happiness, enlightenment, optimism, a sense of well-being, and the serenity of Stoicism, since it is thought that these can only reflect a superficial understanding of life, or a naive and foolish way of denying the despairing, tragic aspect of human existence. This view of life is one of doom and gloom. But however, on the positive side, it's important to, sometimes you get a bit too much doom and gloom, but it's good to look at positives. However, there is also a place for some optimism. The current depth psychology of Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell and others has presented a more positive approach. It replaces the traditional pessimistic and biblically theological fall into sin when Eve ate the proverbial apple, or whatever fruit it was, with the essential and the more positive rise into consciousness and choice-making. So instead of a fall into sin, this way of thinking says it was actually an essential rise into consciousness. And to limit it to a fall into sin is only telling half the story and an extremely negative story. And so this is much more positive. So it's part of the individuation journey is rising into consciousness, not falling into sin. This individuation, hero or life journey of each human being occurs, one, from the initial stage of original and primal unconscious wholeness, which is experienced in the unconscious, then two, through the stage of conscious unwholeness and of difficult choice-making, and then finally the required and mature state of consciousness and integrated conscious wholeness. In other words, bringing everything together in an integrated state. Joseph Campbell included these in his hero's journey, which involves the three steps: A, separation from the ego from the primal stage, one. And this relates to Joseph Campbell's hero with 1,000 faces, which in his view involves all humans who are on the same ego or hero's journey. Then B is the initiation into the choice-making of stage 2, of making choices. And that's again where Kierkegaard comes in, that the leap of faith was the leap of confidence. Really, it was a leap of confidence that you are able to make the required choices, which is often very difficult. You've got two choices, you've got dilemmas, and you have to pick one of them. It's a very difficult stage. And for Campbell, it was needed this initiation into that reality. Then finally, the heroic, integrated and fulfilled return to the bliss of stage 3. So Campbell then has a return to the original state of bliss. So certainly much more positive. Anyway, then we deal with absurdity. The third existential theme is that of absurdity. Existentialism accepts that we are responsible for our own existence and choices in life, but we experience as being absurd and inexplicable our existence as human beings. Each of us is simply here, thrown into this time and place without our consent and without our permission. We therefore ask with Kierkegaard, why now? And why here? We hear the answer for no reason, with no necessary connection, only contingently and conditionally, and so our lives are an absurd contingent fact. Blaise Pascal, a French mathematician and philosopher during René Descartes' time, who was also an early forerunner of existentialism, expressed the absurdity of existence thus: "When I consider the short duration of my life, swallowed up in the eternity before and after, and the little space I fill, I even can see, engulfed in the infinite immensity of space of which I am ignorant and which knows me not, I am frightened and am astonished at being here rather than there, and existing now rather than then." And you can see that those two questions come up again in his way of thinking. Then you come to abyss or nothingness, which is also very much of a concern for the early Gnostics, who dealt with very much the pleroma and the abyss in their thinking and theology. But this is now part of existentialism. So the fourth theme which pervades existentialism is that of the abyss or nothingness or the great void. As existentialists, if we allow no essences to define us, or two, if we reject the philosophies, sciences, political theories and religions which we perceive as failing to reflect our existence or conscious beings, and three, if we attempt to impose a specific essentialist structure upon ourselves and our world, then there is nothing that structures our world. We have followed Kierkegaard's lead and we have stripped ourselves of all unacceptable structure, including the structures of knowledge, moral value and human relationship. As a consequence, we stand in an anguish at the edge of the abyss. Although we are our own existence, our existence is a nothingness. This is seen in the Platonic and biblical view that the celestial or heavenly form or essence is the reality, and the terrestrial copy down below on earth is but a mere secondary shadow of the form above. In the Bible, God, who is named El or Yahweh, is depicted as a cosmic absolute above, and humans below are mere shadow images of this God. That's according to the biblical theology. Earth is a vale of tears which awaits the entry of humans into their real home in heaven. These two realms of earth below and heaven above were depicted in the well-known ancient Hermetic principle, as above, so below, or the other way around, as below, so above. So there was a matching between, always between earth and heaven. The earth below contained many natural features and living creatures. The heaven above was full of spiritual beings and places whose forms were visible in the stars and constellations, and whose actions were formulated into sky myths. For the ancient storytellers, their sky was alive with its mythic stories. In contrast, our universe today in our 21st century is viewed as being a vast expanse of space with no up and down, and our Earth is a very insignificant planet within this vastness. So here on Earth, therefore, we live without anything secure to structure our being and our world. We are looking into emptiness and into the void, and we are hovering above the abyss in fear and trembling and in living the life of dread. So that's the Gnostic issue of abyss being applied into the present century. What about annihilation? The fifth feature, which is related to the existential theme of nothingness, is complete annihilation in the form of decay and death. This final nothingness hangs over all life forms on our planet Earth, including us mortal humans, as much as we dislike the idea. So it's just like the dangerously dangling sword of Damocles, which is held only by a few fine threads during each moment of our lives. Hence, we are filled with a deep and nagging anxiety at the times when we permit ourselves to be aware of this and to confront the thought of the visit of the restless reaper. Now, in this context, we get Martin Heidegger. Now, he was a profound, too profound for most people, obviously, but it was a profound and influential German existential philosopher who stated that at such moments as facing up to our deaths, the whole of our being seems to drift away into nothingness. We, who are unaware, try to live as if death is not actual, and we try to escape its reality. But Heidegger says that our human deaths are our most authentic, significant moments and contain our intensely personal potentialities, which we each alone must suffer. If we take death into our lives, acknowledge it and face it squarely, we will free ourselves from the anxiety of death and the pettiness of life, and only then will we be free to become ourselves. Dealing with death in this manner certainly poses some uncomfortable but also some realistic challenges. And so he's finding quite an interesting meaning, actually, in the nothingness and death. However, the French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre has begged to differ from Heidegger. He asks, what is death? And he replies, death is my total non-existence. Death is as absurd as birth. It is no ultimate, authentic moment in my life, but it is nothing but the wiping out of our existence as conscious beings. Death is only another witness to the absurdity of human existence. These two contrasting views indicate that discussions about existentialism, which tend towards being a pessimistic and negative, can also flip the existentialist coin and explore the more optimistic and positive aspects of human existence, of the human condition, and of the need for conscious choices. This now appears to be the concern of the existentialists who have adopted the label spiritual but not religious. Spiritual then covers a lot of these concerns, but not with the help of the traditional religions. Then alienation is probably the biggest issue for existentialism, so we need to look at that rather closely. A sixth theme which characterises existentialism and which has been very influential socially, politically, and economically is alienation, or estrangement, or existing in situations which are lacking in harmony. Alienation is a theme which Wilhelm Hegel, 1770 to 1831, helped to open up for the modern world on many levels and in many subtle forms. Thus, in Hegel's state of alienation, the absolute is estranged from itself, while it exists only in the development of finite spirit in historical time and is relative to our finite and limited human consciousness. Hegel is well known for his use of the concept spirit, and this is where he's using it. This is how he's using it here. So this finite spirit within history, in turn, lives in alienation from its true consciousness of its own true freedom, which it gains only slowly in the dialectic of history, which involve one a thesis or proposition, 2, its antithesis or opposing proposition or advancing proposition, and then third is a synthesis, which brings the two together into a synthesis or a union. There is also social alienation that exists at various levels of society. Perhaps this is one that's been talked about a lot now in social welfare. These include the alienation of individual human beings who pursue their own desires in estrangement from the actual workings of their society. They do not know that their desires are system determined, and they feel trapped as victims of the system. There is therefore an institutional alienation of those who do not identify with the institutions of their own society and who find their society empty and meaningless. There is also, for philosopher Wilhelm Hegel, the alienation which develops in civil society between the small class of the wealthy and the growing discontent of the large class of the impoverished workers, and that idea then fed into Marx. The most profound alienation of all in Hegel's thought is the alienation between consciousness and its object, or the estrangement between our consciousness and its objects as entities relative to our consciousness. So this is very much an issue for every individual person. In this estrangement, we are aware of the otherness of the object and seek in a variety of ways to overcome this alienation by mastering it and by bringing it back into ourselves in some way. Now, when we look at Marx, well, in relation to both economic and social alienation, Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, developed in his Marxism two forms of alienation. One, the young Marx focused upon the concept of economic alienation. He proposed that as workers, we humans are alienated, 1, from ourselves, 2, from the product of our labour, 3, from the money-worshipping society, 4, from all those social institutions such as family, morality, law and government, which coerce us into the service of the money god and keep us from realising our human creative potential. The talk we just heard before this one dealt with this issue of making room for creativity in education, which is very interesting, and that's coming up in the pop-up education features. And so that's an important factor, the creativity. Now, in contrast, the mature Marx stressed social alienation, which was expressed through the society's division of labour and its many ramifications. In Russia, for example, the ruling Tsar, as the Hegelian thesis, and the ruled peasants and the workers as the antithesis, failed to form a workable synthesis, and hence the system failed eventually. This monarchical political and social system was replaced in 1917 by the monopolistic Communist Party, which imposed dictatorial rule over the working class within a classless society, which was this eventual synthesis, which wasn't quite what they were wanting. This system in turn also failed with Russia's return in 1989 to the world of capitalism. And as you all know, it's still a very autocratic system, although we'll see how Trump versus Putin conflict goes. Right, next question is, how then do existentialists use the concept of alienation? Apart from our own conscious being, all else, they say, is otherness, from which we are estranged. We are hemmed in by a world of things which are opaque to us and which we cannot understand. Moreover, science itself has alienated us from nature by its outpouring of highly specialised and mathematicised concepts, laws, theories and technologies, which are unintelligible to the non-specialist and layman. These products of science now stand between us and nature. The Industrial Revolution has alienated the worker from the product of his own labour and has made him into a mechanical component in the productive system, as Marx has stated. And of course, our modern society's gone one step further with its increasing use of robots to do the manual work in factories and work, robots speeding around the factory floors collecting items that are needed. And so humans are being literally replaced now by robots. Such existentialisms existentialists also say that we are also estranged from human institutions, bureaucratised government on the federal, state and local levels, national political parties, giant business corporations, national religious organisations, etc. In fact, the churches are finding that their membership is drastically declining at the moment. All of these appear to be vast impersonal sources of power which have life of their own. As individuals, we neither feel that we are part of them, nor can we understand their workings. We live in alienation from our own institutions. Moreover, we are shut out of history. We no longer have a sense of having roots in a meaningful past, nor do we see ourselves as moving towards a meaningful future. As a result, we do not belong to the past, to the present, or to the future. After all, even the biblical book of Ecclesiastes 1:2 states that all is vanity. Lastly, and perhaps most painfully, the existentialists point out that all of our personal human relationships are poisoned by feelings of alienation from any other. Alienation and hostility arise within the family between parents and children, or they can arise. And they can arise between husband and wife, between the children. Alienation affects all social and work relations, and most cruelly, alienation can dominate the relationship of love. These are the disturbing and provocative themes which can be found in relation to human condition within contemporary existentialism. Now, living successfully, but now we need to ask if this is indeed a true picture of the world in which we human subjects absurdly find ourselves. 1, how is it possible to go on living successfully in it? 2, is there no exit from this anxiety and despair, this nothingness and absurdity, this fixation upon alienation and this hovering on the edge of the abyss? 3, is there any existentialist who can tell us how to live successfully in such an absurd and hopeless world? 4, is there an existentialist ethics and a moral philosophy to tell us what is good and what can be said to be right and wrong in such a meaningless world? Now, at this point, we'll just have a look at what is religious existentialism. We have noted the 6 themes or features of existentialism which we present within both general and atheistic existentialism, and which include, as we've stated, actuality, anxiety, absurdity, the abyss or nothingness, annihilation and alienation. We can now examine how or whether existentialism can also be religious, and in relation to being religious, how it can also be spiritual, and more recently, spiritual but not religious. The definition of religion usually takes into account the contents, main features, and previous history over the past thousands of years of the various world religions. Attempts to understand the nature of religion have therefore tended to focus on a religion's deity, its supernatural dogma, its ethics, and its ritual. The central religious phenomenon is therefore cult, or a system of communal rites of veneration and devotion to a particular person or object. We might call this religion proper. Here we can distinguish between what we call simple religions, which may be small, tribal or leader-inspired group or cult, and the great religions or the world religions, which include the Judeo-Christian religion, Jainism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Zoroastrianism, and others. A distinction here is the presence of a developed spirituality which makes the religion relevant to all of life rather than confined to the required rituals and to the demand of a specific tribe or to a charismatic leader. A major religion, therefore, usually includes three parts: its nature as a cult, its experienced spirituality, and its official theological doctrine or dogmas. Doctrine can include a set of beliefs that provide a theoretical underpinning for the practices engaged in dogma, and dogma can include the officially accepted set of beliefs or creeds or confessions which adherents of the religion are required to confess. Christianity, of course, has had its Apostles' Creed and Nicene Creed, Athanasian Creed, and all those that are still used in churches. These are mostly contained in supernaturally based and regularly recited creeds and confessions. In this context, persons who identify primarily as religious have linked their belief to institutionalised and ritualised expressions of faith. In contrast, many current adherents who can no longer accept as factual and real the religion's claimed supernatural beings, places, events, and doctrines, now prefer to identify themselves simply as spiritual, or as spiritual but not religious, thus relaxing their attachment to a formal and institutionalised religion and focusing on a more individual and subjective personal transcendence and elevation of their psyches. Well, what is spiritual and spiritual but not religious existentialism? The use of the word spiritual within Judaism and Christianity has in the past mostly been employed in relation to the supposed energising powers, gifts and fruits of the Holy Spirit, which are viewed as aspects of their shared deity Yahweh. This spirit is therefore a theistic term. In contrast, increasing numbers of spiritual seekers are in a quest of a more human-based spirituality, not a theologically based one, which is focusing on individual transcendence within. A problem here is that spirituality faces a lack of clarity about what are paradigm cases and what are the criteria for actually defining spirituality and getting that distinction between a secular spirituality and a theological spirituality, obviously. It seems that the new spiritual but not religious, or SBNR movement, is not primarily an attempt to invent something entirely novel, but is a striving after a quality of life and experience already glimpsed within those traditions, but without accepting what is seen as excess baggage involving supernatural and miraculous events, superhuman and miracle-working beings, and imagined and imaginary places. This is why the SBNR show an increased interest in Eastern religion, in the mystical branches and the esoteric doctrines of established churches, and in spiritual exercises like meditation and contemplative prayer. These non-theistic spiritual aspects of tradition include the elements in religions that seem to be attractive now to the SBNR, spiritual but not religious. Spirituality on this basis includes a particular style of ethical life. So a spiritual life can be described as 1, an ethically directed existence; 2, involved in a way of life. We all need a way of life, some way of living. 3, with a particular focus on inner transformation, and transcendence there can be moving from one lower state within to a higher state in an inner transformation. So transcendence can be internalised and made imminent imminent, a sort of an imminent transcendence. And 4, which is adopted in the light of what is taken to be the ultimate. Paul Tillich was one who developed this, and he said we're concerned in ultimate reality, ultimate being, the concerns of the ultimate. They're not necessarily theological, but they are concerns of living in a cosmos. Right, so expanding on these 4 criteria, a spiritual person is one who thinks that there are right and wrong ways to live and has a basic commitment to living in the right way. For the spiritual person, 1, the ethical commitment is a driving force in life, something seen as requiring a constant work and watchfulness. This is in part because for them the primary ethical question is not about the rightness and wrongness of actions, although that is important, but about how to be a virtuous person and how to live the best kind of life. This right way of living constitutes their way of life. And as we said earlier on, the normal philosophy being love of wisdom tends to be more abstract and theoretical. Existentialism has always come across as a way of life. Issues dealing with the way we live. So 3, the decisive move towards spirituality is what can be called the inward turn. This turn is constituted first by the recognition of the absolute centrality of our passionate responses and patterns of thought for our ability to lead flourishing ethical lives. The second, by sustained attention to that inner life in order to bring about positive changes as far as is possible. Historically speaking, it was this approach which made the Stoic ethics seem spiritual in a way that Aristotle's ethics were not. Although Aristotle claimed that the passions were central to virtue, the Stoics went beyond this, developing theories of the different passions, of the passions in general, of their various roles in a good life, and practices aimed to eliminate those which were taken to be problematic. The 4th aspect of spirituality is that the spiritual life takes place within the context of some belief about what is ultimate or fundamental, and at least most vital and basic. In many religion-oriented spiritualities, what is taken to be ultimate or transcendent will turn out to be a personal deity, which they have decreed as being ultimate. You could include Zeus, Yahweh, Allah, Brahma. Such deities may emanate goodwill and promote peace and love, but in contrast, the consequences for humanity have often been deadly when their word in their holy books decrees acts of ill will by their devotees, and the supposed decrees of Muslims from Allah in the Quran include to wage jihad against and to slaughter all the humans who do not accept Allah's decrees. Now that's certainly an example of a deadly cult, but we would like to think that somehow or other that's going to be overcome. I don't know how. But most of the religions have much more positive ultimate gains and ultimate goals. However, the ultimate may also be something more nebulous, like Logos or Tao. For New Age spirituality, it is often something like a general life force extended to others in such Star Wars blessings as "May the Force be with you." It may even be something material, as in the case of the Epicureans, for whom the ultimate was nothing but atoms in the void. What matters here is that there is some theoretical context, however indistinct in details, which draws the person to transcend their vague haze or private anxiety and fantasy and live an ethical life in the light of what is real, or reality, you could call it. Being honest about reality. The emphasis here is therefore not on any particular metaphysical view, but on the idea that spirituality cannot be entirely inwardly focused and cannot be based on any illusions about what the world is like. A spiritual life is one that sees reality for what it is. In short, it requires some view about what the good life is. That is, some conception of the virtues aimed at and how they relate, as well as some view about human psychology, which helps to explain the possibility of and need for the desired transformation. Without some such foundation, spirituality will be aimless and bound to be ineffective. In this context, it's important too that any spirituality includes both empirical science and also experiential experiential spirituality. It's usually depicted science is empirical, that is, it does experiments, it deals with matter, but the spirituality is ethological. Ethological is related to ethics and aesthetics and values. So it's a difference between science seeking the facts and the spirituality dealing with the values. And that was Plato's concern with, the goodness and beauty and truth. What's good, what's beautiful, their values. And so a wider picture must be included, both science and the fundamentalists. You see, they're anti-intellectual. They reject science and just hang on to their theologies. Of course, they're the ones that are the creationists and the flood geologists and the ones that will not accept scientific empirical science. And so it's very hard for them to involve themselves in some sort of spirituality because they're just fundamentalists who are too concerned about defending their fundamentalism. But what we're talking about is a more flexible system where people are prepared to operate empirically with science and also experientially with spirituality. So those two things are absolutely essential, empirical and ethological. So we go on to now point 4 there. What is the modern philosophical, religious and spiritual context for existentialism? Existentialism is not found asserting itself in the history of philosophy as a theoretical system in which humans can arrive at certainty concerning knowledge, as previous philosophers, including epistemologists and logical positivists, have attempted to show. That includes A.J. Ayer. He was a very famous logical positivist who was extremely empirical. If it was empirical and factual, right, that was it. But then he found it very hard to move into the area of values, of aesthetics and ethics. So he was logical positivists were very much into the empirical rather than the experiential. So that created problems, especially back in the 50s and 60s for philosophy. So we go on now. There 2 millennia earlier, Plato wrote about entities having essences which are eternal, unchanging, qualities or a higher reality that precedes their existence. And they're the forms, and down here we're only the shadows, but our real forms are up in the sky. Now our real beings. The concept of essences is explained by the philosopher Samuel Stumpf, who has stated that people all have the same fundamental qualities and therefore are all contained in the same definition of humanity, and that this essence precedes their historic existence. And so you've got to get, again, you're debating between essence and existence. They're both needed. Which is first or second, I suppose it could be considered a minor issue, but for existentialism, they certainly put existence first. So then, in contrast, we go on there, the paragraph, a main tenet of existential philosophy agreed upon by many of its most popular writers and developed by Jean-Paul Sartre was that existence precedes essence, or goes before essence, in contrast to Plato's notion of universal forms or essences. Alfred North Whitehead being an existentialist as well, was specifically critical about Cartesian dualism and despised Descartes' method. Martin Heidegger, who wrote Being and Time, was equally vocal about the previous philosophical methods of Enlightenment thinkers when he said that only by accomplishing the destruction of the ontological tradition do we obtain for the question of being its true concreteness. So he wanted to clear the air of the ontology so that he could re-look at it. And I don't know, not too many have actually made sense of what he's written about that, about his particular ontology, but it is very difficult, I know. Now, page 16, existentialist philosophy and its writers were embarking on the search for the meaning to human existence, much like the empiricists and rationalists from the previous centuries. One of the important distinctions for existentialism was the emphasis on the individual human existence. Important metaphysical questions had been asked by philosophers such as Immanuel Kant, and these questions can be found permeating the writings of Soren Kierkegaard's existential philosophy and his famous work Either Or. And of course, either or means that's the stage where we all have to make our choices. We have to make that leap of trust and confidence that we can do that, and we've got the guts to do it. So existentialism was therefore a new approach to philosophy explaining the existence of the human individual and did not have to direct focus on mathematics, natural science, theology, or psychology in an attempt to assert itself as a true foundation of knowledge. It could be secular, in other words. This feature has made its identity difficult to pinpoint. Existentialism is a philosophy that is immersed in the whole of the Enlightenment and has not been thought to have had much to do with an orthodox view of Christianity. Existentialism is related to recent philosophical movements such as Husserl's phenomenology and can also be found in the work of philosophers and atheist Daniel Dennett, who deals with consciousness today. This emphasis is on the philosophy itself and can lack a general concern for metaphysics. So they're trying to remain practical, in other words. Existentialism is a radical contrast with much of what has been held for over a millennia with Plato in relation to essentialism, or essences, by stating that human existence precedes human essence. The evidence of existential thinking can be found in our culture today and even in the churches, with many people having adopted an individualistic philosophy without much regard for the group as a whole. It is in the reverse of essence preceding existence that existentialism pitches its philosophical lot against God, the creator, and the giver of man's identity. Anthropologists will also add to this that during the long process of geological, biological, and cultural evolution, the emergence and existence of conscious human beings came before and emerged at an earlier date than the formulations and projections up into the heavens of humanity's subsequent host of personified deities and demons, both male and female, and including Yahweh. And so, as you can see, existentialists use this as a weapon against fundamentalists, who put essence first and then existence. They say, well, you've got this essence, but it doesn't exist anyway. This ultimate essence. So anyway, and this existentialists then use it as a weapon. Now, can existentialism be atheist and religious? Just a little bit now to finish it. This was our initial question that we asked. Secular existentialism has fitted nicely into the evolution of the West's Enlightenment philosophies. It is radically individualistic, and it can certainly be atheistic. Jean-Paul Sartre proclaimed himself an existential writer, and atheist philosopher by affirming that to exist is simply to emphasise human individuality, and by insisting that human nature or essence can be defined in advance because it is not completely thought out in advance. He therefore has sought to show that humans are wholly free to choose and create. And that's a very important contribution, that we can't avoid the choices, and we have the ability to be creative. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche confirmed this by stressing the human task of becoming, which is furthered by the will to power. This requires humans to master themselves and their existence. Nietzsche therefore encouraged each individual to live dangerously, to empower themselves to become their own God, and to emerge as the Übermenschen, or the super men, or superior. I think superior probably is a better word there. This task is stopped only by death. Such views are atheistic, but they appear to leave humans without a soul or with a consistent identity. Religious existentialism is more difficult to define because religion can include religious believers who accept in a literal manner the supernatural events and superhuman beings which are depicted in the religion's sacred books, and B, also spiritual seekers who understand these contents in a literary and metaphorical or figurative manner and apply them as poetry to their spiritual quest for integration and wholeness. In other words, they become allegories. For example, where the risen sun at Easter can be understood, in the case of Jesus, to be the entity personified and deified as the risen cosmic Christ, the daily, seasonal and annual solar cycles can act as the physical stages for life's spiritual journey from womb to tomb. This applies in particular to Carl Jung's individuation journey and also Joseph Campbell's adaptation or use of it with his hero's journey. From the primal unconscious wholeness through the choice-making of conscious unwholeness, through to the desired integrated conscious wholeness. Soren Kierkegaard also moved beyond or behind the literal text of the Bible and focused on the individual's quest for an authentic and fact-based religious experience. His three spheres, including 1, the aesthetic, 2, the ethical, and the spiritual, were for him clearly assured realities of life. And as I just mentioned, you'll notice that these are part of the ethological analysis of the human. Ethos is the culture, are the values, the aesthetics, the ethics, the things we value. And so all of Kierkegaard's spheres could be seen to be ethological rather than empirical. But he's still dealing with the realities of life. This isn't understood. People find it hard to distinguish between empirical and ethological. Right, the ethical always involves us in relations with others, and his religious stage indicates a required leap of faith. Such a leap did not involve adopting blind faith in the Church's supernatural dogmas, but adopting the courage to make the needed and required choices in life as they arise. Karl Jaspers, in his work The Great Philosophers, noted that although Kierkegaard related his existential philosophy to Christianity, his ideas were actually an attack on inauthentic Christianity, or you could include there the fundamentalist type Christianity. It is therefore safe to conclude that there can be and has been a strong tradition of atheistic existentialism, but the concept of religious existentialism needs to be qualified so that the various features of existentialism which would not be suitable for a fundamentalistic and literalistic understanding of religions and their sacred books can be explored and appropriated within a more liberal and literary-minded spirituality, and also within the emerging quest by spiritual seekers who identify with being spiritual but not religious. At the moment, there is a group called the Progressive Christians here in Australia. They've been progressive Christians, and they're really on this level of spirituality but not being theologically religious. They try to say, we'll see if we can do without all the supernatural aspects. So it's certainly an ongoing sort of a thing, and there are attempts to follow it. This understanding also indicates that existentialism, with its stress on existing, on ethical living, on choosing wisely, and on goal-driven becoming, can still be a practical, valuable, and widely used life philosophy and a spiritually authentic way of life for we humans today. Thank you for your participation today, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thanks, John, for that spurring advocation of the central tenets of existentialism today. Does anybody have any questions for John?
Yeah, thanks, John. That's a brilliant summary. So much came up, so many questions. My question relates to the relationship between liberalism and existentialism in Australia. Seems to me, it's my prejudice, I suppose, or just my upbringing, that in a liberal family with liberal theology actually as well, that the challenge of making decisions was pretty much resolved in early settlement in Australia through liberalism. And so I'd like you just to reflect on that, whether that's parallel with your experience, relationship between liberalism and existentialism, but also reflect on existentialism today then in this, what seems to be a post-liberal politics.
Well, the trouble is with the word liberal, that's usually considered to be sort of free thinking and the less. It means, but in Australia you could say it's also the conservative side of things. So liberal is a very hard word to use, but in a religious context, obviously, they have put themselves on the side of the free thinkers, who have found that, reciting the creeds, going to church and trying to accept all these supernatural frameworks that are presented, they're not able to do. Whereas the fundamentalists simply say, well, just believe every word, the Bible's inerrant, infallible, so they don't do any thinking about it. And the strange part is when evidence is presented, well, then they're quite happy to say, oh, we don't agree with science, we're anti-science. And so you see...
Since the 70s or whatever, we've seemed to have taken a hermeneutic or literary turn where everything's a story. So, Aboriginals are spiritual. They have their stories. So let's sorry if the question's too broad, but let's focus down first of all on those Australian society in as much as it's taken a literary turn. So the Liberal Party will talk about the principles of Menzies, but they won't document what they are. There's no treatise. You can't look a treatise up. What are the principles of Menzies and how we're applying them today? It's just a story that Menzies had principles. But anyway, if you push them, they will say, well, we're the rights of the individual for self-interest, and these sort of things are principles. Right, okay, so we'll accept that. But then the question in dealing with choice, the necessity of making choices, we want to be liberal, we don't want to be dictatorial, restrict the rights of others. Okay, so that's okay. But then that seems to me, so the first part of the question is do you see that there is a generalised existentialism that's underpinned what we call a liberal, Australian liberal society, the broad church of John Howard? And then how does you see this existentialism playing out in this post-liberal era?
Yeah, it just seems to me with liberal you're dealing with, in general, the laissez-faire idea of freedom and capitalism and everybody can do the best they can. And of course in America, if it produces billionaires, well, that's fine, but bad luck for the people that are starving everywhere. That's political, and they're mostly concerned with political and economic, but the existentialists were concerned very much with human nature. And that's why all of the six things that we mentioned there, the angst, the alienation, all these sort of things, they're very much, they reduce themselves to personal. Even with alienation, they're very concerned about the alienation that comes up between people, even within your own self, different levels. So I think politics, right, they'll pick a bit of existentialism, a bit of whoever, some famous economist or something, whoever suits them, their political program. I don't think it's really, it's not really fair to expect existentialism to be able to dictate what's happening there. They're picking and choosing, but existentialism has taken its stand that they want to analyse the human condition. They find that some of it it's been presented too pessimistically, and they're trying to find positives in it. But I just think we should keep apart liberal thinking in a literary form, in a sense, and liberal in political. Keep them separate. And the other thing about the stories is that, in fact, myths, people say, oh, they're just useless myths, but why I mentioned in here that the sky is full of stories, what's being done now is that people are looking at the old constellations that from 2,000, 3,000 years ago, and they found that the sky was full of thousands of stars. And not only that, what they did was then what could they do at night? They had no television or anything. And so the stars were the Aborigines and early Sumerians and whatnot. They were the source of where they could tell their stories. And the stories began on Earth, some incidents. Like I know with the Pleiades stories, I was up in Central Australia and got the book on Aborigine myths there. Well, they have the story of the Seven Sisters, and they're based on the Pleiades, and they have the story that this Aborigine was chasing these sisters, and then they came down to Earth, and ended up at Port Augusta. But what they've done is sort of that as above, so below, so as below, so above. They lived that. We can't do that now because we look up in the sky, and we're lucky to see 2 or 3 stars in the sky at night here in Melbourne. Yeah, other night there was a nice bright one there. I thought, oh, at least there's one star that's able to peer its way through. But you see, if you take the creation stories, the flood stories and all those, the Mesopotamians, the Sumerians and the Akkadians, they'd already developed all their stories based on all the characters they had up in the sky as constellations. Now, with the creation, they had a god there who was Aquarius, a constellation, and then they had a field there which was a garden. It reflected the earth gardens, but that's where they told their story. And that's why it's a myth, because it didn't take place on Earth. They developed it as their sky stories. The flood, the same thing. There's Argo. There's the great ship up there, the constellation Argo, and that was in part of the watery period where there's the fish, the monster. Same with Jonah. He was caught up with this great Cetus, the monster. Well, this area of the sky was coupled with these constellations relating to water, and that's where great water dramas. And that's where the global flood story was eventually formulated, and that came into the Gilgamesh epic well before the biblical story, thousands of years before, probably. Once these Sumerians and the Akkadians had developed their languages, they were able to identify all these, and they identified them on the basis of Earth. So they took that name up into the sky. And that's called the Hermetic principle, as above, so below. And so just about all the myths, these early myths were actually, they started as something that happened in the sky. In Mesopotamia, probably local floods happening in Tigris and Euphrates, and then they put the Tigris and Euphrates up in the sky, and they were actually Pisces, the two. The fish, where they were connected, they interpreted that as the Tigris and the Euphrates. And there's the fish connected. Well, you've got the location up there, and then you've got a Pegasus, square of Pegasus later, but they made that their field. That was in that language, a field, and that was the ark in their language earlier on, you see. And so they had an ark. They had all the beings there, and they told their stories up in the sky. And now you've got the fundamentalists arguing, building this, gigantic ark, over an Ark Park, because the Bible says so. Well, I mean, there was never a story in Mesopotamia of a huge ark. Mostly, you get is that the archaeologists said, we've been digging down, we found a layer of clay. Right, there were local floods there. You can't deny that. I mean, the Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, they're flooding all the time. And the story could have started because somebody decided, there's a flood coming, I'm going to put all my cattle and sheep and whatnot on a boat and sail to safety. Just on a very local level. And it didn't take much for people admiring those thousands of stars that are up there, and all the star names, all the stars were seen as angels and spirit beings, and they had names, for all the constellations, and so they developed these great stories. I call them sky stories rather than myths. But the Bible, Genesis 1 to 11 is virtually all sky stories that the fundamentalists are arguing about. They're looking for a Garden of Eden. Well, obviously they're not going to find it in Mesopotamia, because it was all formulated up in the sky, in the stars, amongst the stars. And that sort of raises this whole issue of the literary side of things rather than literal. Yeah, and that's what you were getting at. I wouldn't mix liberal political and liberal religious, but liberal religious are people that are more concerned about the literary side and using these things as allegories for their own life. And that was Jung. Jung's idea was that they're projected. He accepted that they were projected out there as stories but that we can bring them back. And he liked the word anagogical. Anagogical means something that you use that leads you along your path for life. And Joseph Campbell obviously took that up, and he wrote the book The Myths, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and he just found that everywhere there was a hero story, it was usually based on a solar hero who has gone through the 12 constellations, and they've been around for like 6,000 years. You know, the zodiac constellations, pretty well intact too. Even the Greeks didn't change many of them. You know, that's how solid the thinking was. Samson in the Bible is a sun hero who did impossible things, in the story of tying the foxes' tails together and all these sort of things. But these were like the 12 labours of Hercules. Again, Hercules, you see, you can match all the things that Hercules did. They told stories on Earth, and they made sense on Earth, but in fact they were all connected with the 12 signs of the zodiac. And they say even the soul, the view of the soul coming down. Clement of Alexandria apparently, he said, I saw it in his book, he said that before birth the soul comes down from Aries, and then it goes to the Virgin Virgo up in the sky, and that's where it becomes conceived, is in a virgin. And that's why that's in everything, because the people were following the soul down through the sky. Then it gets to Capricorn, where there's mangers and animals and stuff depicted, and so they're born, in that context. And along comes Jesus, and he gets the same story. It's all there, we need to be honest about this, and that's what existentialism is trying to do, to be honest and look at the whole picture. Okay, you might find nothingness, but you'll also find that they at least say that it's important not to just be caught in the concept of sin, original sin, which has ruined the churches. They say, no, it was the greatest thing that's happened. It was a rise into consciousness. Choices. It was a rise into the ability to make choices.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
We've got another question down here.
Right, yeah. Sorry, I got a bit carried away there. But
I'm interested in this, the kind of clinging to the idea of essence that happens in...
A bit louder, I can't hear.
Sorry, okay. A bit closer to the microphone. You brought up the idea of a fallen nature as in relation to existentialism, which I thought was interesting, because I feel like there's some kind of tension between that and then the idea of like existence over essence, because if you are presupposing some kind of pessimism about human nature, which you do see in a lot of this existentialist writing, is there's kind of a core pessimism about human nature. How does that then like account for that clinging to I mean, if you're saying that there's something wrong in human nature that we have to be overcoming, even in Nietzsche, like you're overcoming man, is that not a kind of essence? And why, if we're going to have existence over essence, why not get rid of essence entirely, go the Buddhist path? So yeah, I wanted to hear your thoughts about the usage of essence.
Yeah, I heard a few words there. Perhaps I missed some from the echo, but I know the whole issue of essence and existence is a problem. Ontologists, those ontos is being, dealing with being, and epistemology is dealing with knowledge, and existentialism is dealing with existence. And so they're going to each argue that they have priority. The essentialists will say, we have priority with essence, like Plato. Essence was their priority. But then the existentialists will say, no, I give my priority to existence. Now, perhaps you could argue, someone could come along and say, well, you can't have essence on its own, right? There's going to be an essence and there'll be some sort of existence. There'll be some sort of consequence. And someone, in other words, you can argue in the end that they're exactly the same thing, the same point. Is it really possible to say existence came before essence? Someone will say, no, essence came before existence. So it's an open thing, but all I'm saying is that existentialists promote that existence came before essence.
But then how can you account for the pessimism about human nature? The pessimism about human nature that you see in a lot of this existentialist writing. Like, even within, any a lot of these, especially I think Sartre,
Yeah, I'm just...
there's an idea of like I don't know, the pessimism about reality even, isn't that of an essence as well?
Yeah. I'm not quite. I've missed some key points that you've been mentioning. I'm not quite sure if I can add anything more. I mean, human nature is going to be argued about. I'll experience my human nature, you'll experience your human nature, and then Heidegger or someone will go along with, an ontologist will say, well, no, essence is obviously before existence. We'll never settle that one. But it's a matter of, if you're an existentialist, then you say, okay, existence has priority over essence. Ontologists will say essence has priority over existence. And then you can privately look at your own human condition and say, I wonder where I fit. Okay, put up your hand if you think in your human nature it's essence precedes essence first, then existence. How many think existence first, then essence? Yeah, so we could argue that till kingdom come. Anyway, look, I appreciate that, but I just, a couple of words I couldn't quite catch it, I think. Anyway, that's one of the issues, yeah. Yeah, I think that last one is quite interesting, that this puts existentialism in a category that is slightly different from the academic philosophy, which is this love of wisdom, and that is to view it actually as a way of life. And I can't see any other way of doing that, because it's so practical. You know, it's looking at existence, it's looking at how you face existence, what you do, what choices you make, and all that sort of thing. And so that certainly makes, I think, makes existentialism quite unique that way. And very practical and useful. I mean, it forces you to say, well, what sort of way of life do I need to develop for myself? You're not being spoon-fed by somebody. It's something that you have to do. Yes, you've got a question there.
Do you think that, given a blank slate, do you think that focusing on an existential frame of reference, that it promotes more bottom-up social structures like anarchism, as opposed to any top-down, due to its institutional alienation? So do you think that, given a blank slate, someone who identifies as an existentialist would promote those kind of social structures? And if so, does that have then issues with being compatible with a religion that's inherently institutional in nature?
You're interested in hierarchies, which way the hierarchy goes, from that way down or down up. Yeah. Well, the whole thing was that originally with alienation, the attempt was to work from the bottom down. So you've got a completely happy mass, and then everything just works fine. But it didn't turn out that way. The bottom didn't want to respond, and so then that's when Lenin and the revolution, communist revolution, stepped in, 1917, and it became totally the opposite. Hierarchy top down. So you're quite correct. That's an important issue. Marx tried to cover all this already in the 1800s, but he tended to be at that stage more level. You know, he was, how's it going to affect institutions in society, the economy? So he actually, even though it's quite clear, you know, we mentioned there the two divisions, that earlier in his life he was more interested in the social side of it, but then later on he felt that he really had to develop the economic. And that's when, you know, he became much more dogmatic. And of course, that's the first thing then that communist parties do, 5-year plans and 10-year plans, and the economy's the big thing. And those social institutions, well, they become secondary, you know, people are expected just to go along with whatever. And Putin is a good example now. He's got everything under total control. Absolutely. And people there are happy somehow, you know, they call them the clap people, the Russians, you know, they're forever clapping, you know, what he does. And he's got them under total control. It's a very sad situation, really. Yeah, so certainly the hierarchy is interesting because it's so flexible. You know, theoretically, you might try to start bottom up, but then turns into top down, and we can see the results now. And that's why I mentioned it'd be interesting to see Trump's claims that he can do something about the Ukraine issue. Well, I don't know. To people with autocratic type minds, maybe something will happen. I don't know. Yeah, but anyway, that's it. That's an important issue for practical existentialism, and especially the issue of alienation. Certainly. Yeah, that's a good point.
John, can I maybe ask you a question about the history of the Existentialist Society? Can you maybe just elaborate a little bit more on its history and some of its iterations and how it works and its ethics and its organisational element? Yeah.
Yes, in the 1970s, Professor Max Charlesworth, introduced existentialism as a course at Melbourne University, and it wasn't welcomed. The other professors were more ontological and, with philosophy as a love of wisdom and often very theoretical. And they wanted it to be very academic. And but he got the course going, and what he did was he was happy to talk to groups outside, and so when David Miller started the Existentialist Society in the 1970s, we were meeting in the Royal Institute, Victoria Street, the Royal, what do they call it? The Royal House. Where the scientists meet. Anyway, but then he moved to different locations where he get a venue, at the Trades Hall for a while, and then the Unitarian Church in East Melbourne. But it was very much helping the issue at the time when Max Charlesworth was having a bit of problem at Melbourne University, and so he came along and talked several times. And it found that there were very interesting issues. Dostoevsky came up, and that branched off into a study of Dostoevsky. But then from 1970s onwards, as I say, David Miller just kept it going, and in the different venues that I just mentioned. And when the COVID came in, it was made into Zoom, so he had Zoom, and now he's got quite a good group. He can get up to 40 or 50 people on the Zoom, and then they go all Saturday afternoon on. There's an existentialist one of the Saturdays. He does it every Saturday from 2 o'clock onwards, and sometimes they go till 6 o'clock. Or, that's when he officially finishes. And so he's got Zoom sessions on existentialism, but it always raises interesting issues. As I was, from the talk today, you can see there's lots of aspects to it. Lots of different aspects to the issues, the themes that they deal with, and so there's never a shortage of speakers or talks, and so he's still going. And he was very pleased then that we could make use of this opportunity here, just to show that existentialism is a fairly practical sort of a philosophy, if you can call it that. And so he organised that we supply a speaker. So that's about the long and the short of it. And it was really the initiative of Max Charlesworth, you know, who introduced it here to Melbourne, and then we simply followed on, and it's still going. Although Max is now, I think he's passed on, but he'd always lecture, and no notes or anything. He'd just come in and talk for an hour. It was quite amusing. Same with his lectures at the uni. He'd really soaked it up, and he could just sprout it like that. So even that was quite impressive.
Thanks.
Yeah, but that's just gives you a little bit of background, and it is practical in a way. It's it's not just sort of metaphysical speculating or abstractions or anything. It's a very practical sort of a way of philosophising, I think, and it's still going. Whereas in the 70s, I think the professors at the Melbourne University preferred that it not be called a philosophy. Well, it's still going.
Thanks very much for that talk. Can you hear me?
A bit louder. Put it closer.
Oh, okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Really fantastic sweep of the history of ideas coming up to existentialism. I'm wondering if you or the Existentialist Society are also interested in more contemporary ways of thinking that goes beyond epistemology, ontology, towards a phenomenology of subjectivity, of the sense of what it means to be a self in relationship to others, and also deconstruction, postmodernism, post-colonialism, I think, is really significant today. I mean, I'm just wondering if the Existentialist Society is open to thinkers like Levinas and Derrida and so on.
Yeah, most of the existentialism has still been in the old school, really. I haven't heard much attempt to bring in postmodernism or phenomenology is different. Phenomenology was developed by Husserl, and he was trying to get to the bottom of reality, or to the guts of everything, and he ended up very mystical. He was trying to get deeper and deeper, and then he found himself being a modern mystic, virtually, in his phenomenology. So I don't know whether that would have helped existentialists all that much. I did bring it in because he was considered important at the time. But, you can become so reductionistic that you're left with nothing. That's a problem with everything, and that phenomenology tended to go that way. But what you're always looking at, you've got that going back all the time, but what you're always looking for is something sort of progressive as well. There's regression, and you're trying to get back to the source or the origin, which could end you up in nothingness. And so you're always looking for the positive, what's producing, what's moving forward. And with the existentialists, it's always been some aspects of these issues that, all these different issues that were brought up. And we were studying the Valentinian Gnostics last Saturday, and it went for 4 hours talking about the old Gnostics in first century. But that wasn't part of existentialism. That was his religion studies. But that kept bringing up abyss and there's some of these issues that they came into it. Nothingness. The Gnostics simply had a vast view of the cosmos out there as this pleroma, and then there was a borderline, and then below that was Earth, and that's where Mary Magdalene comes into the picture. She was a historical depiction of Sophia up there in the sky. Sophia then became crossed down and fell into the matter, where she became Mary Magdalene. And of course, the Catholics didn't know what to do with her, so they turned her into a prostitute. But in fact, for the Gnostics, she then went back again. She was saved because she knew the passwords. Gnosticism was to know the passwords to get through all those spheres to get up to the ineffable. That's the ultimate. And so perhaps getting back to Tillich's idea of ultimate concern, this was the ultimate state where you ascend up to the ineffable. So David is I suppose I should sort of refer to David. He's the one who's organising all these things, and he's interested, and it turns out that quite often there are things that are shared. So incidentally, not necessarily deliberately. Yeah, so your question is interesting to that extent that it is, his program is moving it into quite interesting areas. See, another interesting thing is in this historical process of bringing things down from the sky, John's Gospel has a resurrection of a bloke called Lazarus, but in fact they're looking at that now, and they're finding that in fact Lazarus is simply another name for Osiris in Egypt, and Isis was called Mary, Meri, and so you have all the characters there in Egypt, and what characters you even got Nephthys, who was Meriti or Martha, and if you look at the characters in John, what have you got there? You've got Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. He's all wrapped up like a mummy. And you've got Mary there, and Martha. So they say that the whole John 12, where the resurrection is simply a historicisation of the Osiris story as the source of it. So there's all these sort of things that are coming up in these discussions, and so anyway, I could go on and on. Okay.
So what's the burning existential issue today? Let me have a go again. So it's a popular phrase today to say Tina. There is no alternative in decision making. And of course this is linked with neoliberalism, whereby the market decides. Really, as individuals, we don't have a choice. We just have to do what the market will best promote. So is that the existential question, or is there another question? How does the one individual decide against the market?
Yeah, see, they throw it back to the individual always, and it's up to the individual to...
Yeah, that's right. Going back to the Liberals again,
whatever context you're in, well, then you need to make it personal for yourself. It's a very personal thing. A little bit like the Gnostics. Their system was very much personal. It made sense to them. And then the new leader came along, and he came along with a new system. And that's why the official church had it so easy to get rid of the Gnostics, because they just had to go to these individuals, and they didn't agree with each other. They had different systems, different cosmologies. And eventually they picked the one that was floating around as a Christian one, and made that the Nicene Creed, and then by 380 that was imposed on the whole Roman Empire as the official Roman Christian religion. Everyone had to follow it. First of all, Constantine allowed freedom of religion, and then the Edict of Milan, that was 313. But 380, Theodosius decreed that the only religion in the Roman Empire was to be the Christian religion based on the Nicene Creed. That's why you get the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy, and they took over Western Europe, because they were the only religion.
Yeah, well, that's right. You've touched on it before in terms of libertarianism, you know. So it's all about me and my freedom. The decision is for me to maximise my freedom, and but you can't impose your freedom on me. When your freedom impinges on my freedom, then you're not allowed your freedom. So we end up with this existential issue around individual freedom.
Oh, yeah, on that point, yeah. But you see, then paradoxically, when the church decreed only the Christian religion, Nicene Creed, then they were not allowing freedom for anybody else to follow that. But at the same time, they didn't allow the freedom of of them to choose anything else. So there was a depriving of freedom, and you wonder who had the freedom. Only the Roman emperor. Everyone else had to kowtow. So freedom is always multiple, it's multi-directional, multi-level. It's an important issue, but it's very, it can be very subjective too. Oh dear.
I think we're good. We're good. John, thank you very much, and also I'll send David an email thanking him for his hard work and efforts in making your appearance possible. So I think we should thank John for thank you very much.
Well, thanks for the questions and discussion. Sorry, there's a bit of an echo here. I couldn't pick up some of the words. I'm sorry about that, but otherwise you've brought up some very important questions, and I hope that you can see that it's a way of life that you can examine and see how it anagogically applies to you. That's why I think it's one of the practical philosophies, not just metaphysical hypothesising, but it's a very practical sort of a system. Well, thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you, mate.